Moses, a leader chosen by God. The story of Moses is one of faith, leadership, and transformation. From his miraculous rescue as an infant to leading the Israelites to the Promised Land's threshold, Moses' journey teaches us powerful lessons about overcoming fear, trusting God's direction, and the importance of obedience. Overcoming fear and insecurity. Moses' story begins in Egypt, where he was born at a time when Pharaoh had ordered all Hebrew male infants to be killed. Saved by God's providence, he was placed in a basket and set afloat on the Nile, only to be discovered and raised in Pharaoh's palace by the princess herself. Though raised as an Egyptian prince, Moses always knew he was a Hebrew. At 40 years old, Moses killed an Egyptian who was beating a Hebrew slave. Fearful of the consequences, he fled to Midian, becoming a shepherd. For 40 years, he lived in obscurity, believing his chance to help his people had passed. But at 80 years old, God called him from a burning bush, telling him to return to Egypt and demand that Pharaoh release the Israelites. Despite the divine encounter, Moses was filled with self-doubt. "Who am I to stand before Pharaoh? I am slow of speech." But God reassured him, "I will be with you." This reminds us that God doesn't call the qualified, He qualifies the called. Our insecurities should never stop us from fulfilling our divine purpose. Even after witnessing God's power firsthand, Moses continued to struggle with doubt. He asked God to send someone else, yet God remained patient, assigning Aaron to speak on his behalf. This illustrates an important truth. God meets us where we are and provides help when we need it. Trusting God's direction. Leading Israel out of Egypt was no simple task. Pharaoh refused repeatedly, and each refusal brought a plague upon Egypt. The plagues were not just punishments but direct challenges to the Egyptian gods, demonstrating that the Lord alone was supreme. When Pharaoh finally relented after the death of the firstborn, Moses led the Israelites out. But soon they found themselves trapped between Pharaoh's army and the Red Sea. Imagine the fear they must have felt. But Moses, now strong in faith, told them, "Do not be afraid. Stand firm and see the deliverance the Lord will bring you today." Exodus 14:13. With God's power, Moses stretched out his staff, and the sea parted, allowing them to cross on dry ground. A little-known fact. Ancient historians suggest that the Red Sea crossing might have taken place in a location called the Sea of Reeds, where powerful winds could create a temporary land bridge. Regardless of how God did it, His miraculous intervention saved His people. Even after this great miracle, the Israelites struggled to trust God. They grumbled about food and water, forgetting the mighty works He had already done. God provided manna from heaven and water from a rock, yet their faith wavered repeatedly. This shows us how easy it is to doubt even after experiencing God's faithfulness. Moses' patience was tested time and again. When the Israelites made the golden calf while he was on Mount Sinai receiving the 10 Commandments, Moses interceded for them despite his anger. He pleaded with God to spare them, showing his deep love for his people. His leadership was not just about guiding them physically, but also spiritually, reminding them of God's laws and calling them to repentance. Obedience and consequences. As the Israelites journeyed, they often doubted God. At Meribah, they complained about a lack of water. God commanded Moses to speak to a rock so that it would bring forth water. But in frustration, Moses struck the rock instead. Though water still flowed, his disobedience had consequences. God told him he would not enter the Promised Land. Numbers 20:12. This teaches us that obedience to God is crucial, even in moments of frustration. Leadership requires self-control. And even great leaders like Moses faced consequences when they let emotions dictate their actions. Yet despite this, Moses remained faithful. He continued to intercede for the Israelites, plead for God's mercy, and lead them with wisdom and patience. His relationship with God was unique. He spoke with God face to face, as a man speaks with his friend. Exodus 33:11. Moses also ensured the Israelites understood their covenant with God. He restated the law in Deuteronomy, reinforcing the need to remain faithful to God's commands. This moment highlights his role not just as a leader, but as a teacher, ensuring the next generation knew God's will before they entered the Promised Land. Final lessons from Moses' life. Moses lived to be 120 years old, and despite his mistakes, God still called him his friend. He saw the Promised Land from Mount Nebo but was not allowed to enter. However, centuries later, Moses did step into the Promised Land when he appeared with Elijah on the Mount of Transfiguration with Jesus. Matthew 17:3. This is a powerful reminder that while earthly consequences exist, God's grace is greater. Moses' faithfulness was ultimately honored in an even greater way. More unknown facts about Moses. His name has Egyptian roots. The name Moses is believed to come from the Egyptian word Mos, meaning son or born of, which was commonly used in names like Thutmose, son of Thoth, or Ramesses, son of Ra. Moses' wife was a Midianite. Zipporah, Moses' wife, was the daughter of Jethro, a Midianite priest. This suggests Moses had deep ties to a non-Israelite culture for much of his life. He had a mysterious burial. Unlike other biblical figures, Moses' burial site remains unknown. Deuteronomy 34:6 says that God himself buried Moses, and no one knows where his grave is. He wrote more than the law. While known for receiving the Ten Commandments, Moses also wrote the first 5 books of the Bible, known as the Torah. Moses' leadership spanned 40 years. He led the Israelites through the wilderness for 4 decades, guiding them through battles, rebellions, and miracles. Applying Moses' story to our lives. Overcoming fear. If you doubt yourself, remember Moses. God will equip you for what he has called you to do. Trusting God's direction. Even when the path seems impossible, God can make a way where there is none. Obedience matters. Disobedience can delay our blessings, but God's mercy always has the final say. God's plans are bigger than ours. Moses never entered the Promised Land in his lifetime, but his legacy continued for generations. Interceding for others. Moses constantly prayed for his people, teaching us the power of standing in the gap for others. Moses' journey encourages us to trust God fully, obey his commands, and walk boldly in our calling. No matter our insecurities or past failures, God can use us for his divine purposes, just as he used Moses. His life reminds us that faith, perseverance, and obedience bring us closer to God's ultimate plan.